The clock on the wall of the administrative office made a sound like a dry bone snapping. Each tick was 1 second closer to his 18th birthday. Each tick 1 second closer to eviction. For 6 years, the state of Illinois had been his landlord, his guardian, his parent. In 72 hours, it was firing him from the job of being its child. Caleb Mercer sat in a plastic chair that squeaked every time he shifted his weight. The fluorescent lights above him buzzed with the low, persistent hum of a government building that had stopped caring about comfort sometime around 1987. The walls were the color of old teeth. The floor tiles were cracked in the corners and peeling near the radiator. Everything in this room was designed to be endured, not enjoyed. Ms. Dunham, his caseworker for the final 2 of those 6 years, sat across from him at a gray laminate table. She was a woman in her late 40s with reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, and a face that carried the practiced neutrality of someone who delivered life-altering news, good and bad, a dozen times a week. Usually bad. Her hands were folded over a thin manila envelope. She slid it across the table toward him. "Caleb," she said. Her voice was quiet but firm, not unkind. "This is it, the last of the paperwork." He stared at the envelope. It was too thin to be a future. It was barely a past. He had spent the last week in a series of mandatory exit interviews and life skills workshops. They taught you how to write a check you had no money to key, how to interview for a job you had no address to put on the application. They taught you how to be a ghost in the machine. They did not teach you how to not be terrified. "There's one more thing," she said, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the corner of the envelope. "It's unusual. It came from the county tax office addressed to the agency as your legal guardian." He didn't move. He expected it to be a final bill, a charge for his own upbringing, a receipt for a childhood that had been rented, never owned. "It concerns your grandfather." The name hit him like a stone skipped across still water. A single sharp impact, then ripples of memory he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Gramps. Walter Mercer was the last real family Caleb had before all of this. Before the group homes and the system and the endless succession of beige rooms and temporary beds. Walter had passed away when Caleb was 11. A sudden heart attack on a Tuesday afternoon that felt like the world tilting sideways off its axis. One minute the man was there solid and smelling of motor oil and pipe tobacco and damp soil, and the next minute he was gone, and the world had a hole in it that never filled back up. After Walter was gone, there was nobody. Just the state. Caleb finally reached for the envelope. His fingers felt thick, clumsy, like they belonged to someone else. Inside was a single sheet of paper, heavy and official, covered in dense, blocky text. It was a tax delinquency notice. At the top, his grandfather's name, Walter Mercer. Below it, a parcel number and a legal description of a property Caleb never knew existed. 1.2 acres in a county he had never heard of, a place called Harlan Flats, out past the edge of the state's interior, where the interstate gave way to 2-lane roads and the towns got smaller and quieter until they disappeared entirely. The notice explained that the property, having been delinquent on taxes for 7 years, had reverted to the county. But a strange, archaic clause was cited. Because the registered heir was a minor under state guardianship at the time of reversion, the heir had a 30-day window upon reaching the age of majority to reclaim the property. The reclamation fee was listed at the bottom of the page. $6. Caleb laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a burst of air, sharp and bitter, the kind of laugh that happens when the universe decides to tell you a joke, and you're the punchline. $6 for what? A patch of weeds. From the satellite images, that's about right, Ms. Dunham confirmed. Her tone was dry. She was already one step ahead, as always. She turned her laptop screen around to face him. On the screen was a grainy aerial photograph of a flat, scrubby piece of land in what looked like the middle of absolutely nowhere. Brown dirt, pale green brush. And in the center of that desolate square, a single silver-gray shape sat like a metal tube cut in half and set down on the earth. "There's a structure on it," she said. "Looks like a Quonset hut. Probably derelict." Derelict. A good word. A word that fit the building on the screen, and the boy sitting in the chair, and the distance between who he was and who he would have to become in 72 hours when that clock on the wall ran out. A worthless building on a worthless piece of land. His inheritance, his kingdom. The system raises you, chews you up, and spits you out with nothing but a bus token and a claim on a rusty tin shed for $6. He should have crumpled it up. He should have thrown it in the trash and walked out and never looked back. The smart money was on forgetting. The safe bet was on leaving the dead in the ground where they belonged. But he didn't. Because as pathetic as it was, that piece of paper was the only thing in the entire world with his name on it. Or close enough. It had his grandfather's name on it, and that was the closest thing to belonging Caleb Mercer had ever known. "You have 72 hours, Caleb," Ms. Dunham said, her voice softening. "At noon on Friday, you walk out of here. You can walk out with this piece of paper, or you can walk out with nothing. The bus ticket we provide can get you to Harlan Flats. It's a long shot. It's probably a dead end. But it's a direction." A direction. He looked from the screen to the paper in his hand. 1.2 acres. A Quonset hut. $6. It wasn't a future. It wasn't a home. But like she said, it was a direction. West toward a place he didn't know, to claim a thing he didn't understand, left behind by a man he desperately missed. He slid the paper back into the envelope and pushed it into the pocket of his thin jacket. "Okay," he said. The word felt small and foreign in his own mouth. "How do I pay the $6? The next 2 days were a blur of hollow goodbyes and the quiet, methodical erasure of his existence from the group home. He packed his life into a single black duffel bag, a few changes of clothes, a worn paperback, a toothbrush, a half-empty tube of toothpaste. That was it. That was the entire physical sum of Caleb Mercer. Everything he owned could fit in one hand and weigh less than a house cat. The other kids in the home, the ones who had been there longer, the ones who knew the rhythm of this place, the way a prisoner knows the rhythm of a cell block, gave him knowing, sympathetic looks. They had seen this movie before. The quiet kid with the sad eyes gets his ticket and vanishes into the world outside the walls, and most of them are never heard from again. Some end up in shelters, some end up in jail, some end up nowhere at all. The system doesn't track you once you're out. You're a file that gets closed to bed, that gets reassigned, a name that gets erased from the whiteboard in the hallway. Ms. Dunham met him at the door on Friday morning just before noon, the final tick of the clock. She wasn't supposed to be there. Her job was done. The paperwork was filed, the transition plan was completed, and Caleb Mercer was officially no longer the responsibility of the state. But she stood there anyway in the cold morning light that came through the glass doors, holding a thick winter coat she had bought with her own money and a brown paper bag with a sandwich and a bottle of water inside. She didn't make a big deal out of it. She just held the items out to him. "It gets cold out there," she said. "The bus leaves in an hour." She had also handled the property paperwork. His $6 paid via a money order had been overnighted to the Harlan Flats County clerk. The property was legally his, a fact that felt as surreal and weightless as a dream. He owned dirt. He owned a rusting curve of corrugated metals, a place he had never seen. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, the question he had wanted to ask for 2 days. She adjusted the strap of her purse and looked past him for a second at the long, sterile hallway he was leaving behind. The fluorescent lights, the scuffed floor, the sounds of other kids in other rooms waiting for their own clocks to run out. "Because my job is to make sure you're processed out of the system," she said. Her voice was clinical again, professional. Then she met his eyes. "My purpose is to make sure you have a chance. There's a difference." She gave him a sad smile, the kind of smile that costs something to make. "Go find out what your grandfather left you." He walked out the door and didn't look back. The air outside was cold and sharp and smelled of exhaust fumes from the muddy bus idling at the curb. It wasn't sweet. It wasn't the first breath of freedom that movies make it out to be. It was just air. It was just the world, vast and indifferent, waiting to see what he would do next. Caleb Mercer was 18 years old. He had a duffel bag, a bus ticket, a gifted coat, and the deed to a rusty shed in the middle of nowhere. It felt less like a beginning and more like the long, slow exhale before an ending. The bus ride was 18 hours of rattling windows and the low drone of an engine that vibrated deep in his bones. He sat in the back row, his duffel bag wedged between his knees, his forehead resting against the cold glass. The city peeled away in layers. First, the dense gray vertical of the downtown. Then the sprawling, low-rise grid of the suburbs, strip malls, and parking lots and chain restaurants blurring into one long smear of commerce. Then further past the last exit into the rolling hills and wide-open farmland of the state's interior. The further they went, the emptier the bus became. Passengers got off at small-town stops, a woman with grocery bags, a college kid with headphones, a man in work boots who nodded at the driver and disappeared into the night. By hour 12, it was just Caleb, an old woman sleeping 3 rows up with her mouth open, and the driver. The landscape flattened. The trees grew sparse and stunted. The sky got bigger, not just wider but taller, as if the ceiling of the world had been lifted, and what was revealed behind it was a vast, indifferent blue that went on forever in every direction. This was the country his grandfather had chosen. Or maybe it had chosen him. Caleb tried to remember the man, not the version softened by childhood memory, not the warm blur of safety and pipe smoke, but the real man. Walter Mercer. He was an engineer, Caleb thought, or a mechanic, something with his hands. He was always tinkering. His fingers were permanently stained with grease, his knuckles scarred and rough. He had a workshop behind a small house in the suburbs, a locked room that Caleb was never allowed to enter. Walter called it his lab. He was preoccupied, always sketching things in notebooks, dense pages filled with diagrams and calculations, notes about angles and load-bearing capacities, and something he called shielding. Caleb had thought he was just an eccentric old man lost in his hobbies, the kind of grandfather who muttered to himself and forgot to eat dinner and stayed up too late with a pencil behind his ear. But there was also the sadness. That was the thing Caleb remembered most clearly, a weight behind Walter's eyes that never fully lifted even when he smiled. When Caleb asked about his parents who had died when he was very young, Walter would get a faraway look as though he were staring through the wall at something only he could see. "They were good people, Caleb," he would say, his voice a low, tired rumble. "They just ran out of time." Now staring out the bus window at the flat, dark expanse of the American interior, Caleb turned that phrase over in his mind. They just ran out of time. It had always sounded like a gentle way of saying they died too young. But sitting here heading toward a piece of land Walter had secretly bought in a structure he had secretly built, the words felt different, heavier, like they were carrying something Walter had never been able to say out loud. Why would a quiet old man buy a plot of land in the middle of nowhere and put a Quonset hut on it? What was he building? What was he hiding? The bus hissed to a stop at a crossroads. There was no station, no platform, no bench. Just a leaning road sign that said, Harlan Flats Pop. 412 in faded white letters on green metal. Behind it, a gas station with a flickering neon open sign and a diner next door that looked like it had been closed for a decade. The windows were boarded. The parking lot was cracked and overgrown. "This is you, son," the driver said. He didn't turn around. Caleb grabbed his duffel bag and stepped down off the bus. The doors folded shut behind him. The bus pulled away, its red taillights shrinking into the twilight like two embers carried off by the wind. And then they were gone, and the silence rushed in. It was a different kind of silence than anything he had ever known. Not the muffled silence of a group home at night, where you could always hear someone breathing or crying or pacing in the hallway. This was the silence of the earth itself, vast, patient, complete. The kind of silence that has weight and texture that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. The air was different too, clean and cold and carrying the scent of dust and dry grass and something else, something vaguely chemical, like fertilizer or pesticide, a faint bitterness that sat at the back of his throat. He stood alone at the crossroads, a ghost who had finally arrived at his haunting ground. The gas station clerk was a teenager with bored eyes who gave him directions with a series of vague gestures. "Old Man Mercer's place." "Yeah, I guess. It's out on the old service road. About a 5-mile walk. Nothing out there but dirt and that big tin can of his." 5 miles, of course. Caleb shifted the duffel bag on his shoulder and started walking. The cracked asphalt of the road dwindled into a gravel track within the first mile. The sun had already set and the sky was a deep, star-dusted purple. There were no streetlights. The only illumination came from a sliver of moon and the cold, hard points of 1,000 stars. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. The two feelings lived in the same breath. The world felt ancient out here, alive in a way that cities never are. He could hear the chirping of crickets, the rustle of something moving through the tall grass by the road. An owl somewhere in the distance calling out into the dark. He felt small, not in the way the system had made him feel small, diminished, processed, reduced to a case number, but small in the way a man feels small when he stands at the edge of the ocean for the first time. Insignificant against something vast and unmoved by his existence. A single human figure walking a dirt road under a sky that had looked exactly the same 1,000 years ago and would look exactly the same 1,000 years from now. After what felt like an eternity of walking, he saw it. The moonlight caught the curve of the metal roof first, a dull silver gleam against the dark horizon like the back of some enormous sleeping animal. Then the shape resolved itself as he got closer, the long, arched form of a Quonset hut sitting alone on the flat earth, surrounded by nothing. It was bigger than he had imagined. The satellite photo hadn't conveyed the scale. The structure was maybe 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, a half-cylinder of corrugated metal bolted to a concrete foundation slab. It looked like something left over from a war that nobody remembered, the kind of building the military put up in a week and forgot about for 50 years. The land around it was choked with weeds and scrub brush. A rusted barbed wire fence sagged and leaned in several places, marking the boundary of his 1.2 acres. His kingdom of dirt. There was a heavy padlock on the main sliding door, but it was so corroded that a few solid kicks loosened the hasp, and a hard yank tore it free. The door groaned open on a track clogged with rust and grit, and years of neglect, revealing a darkness within that was so complete it seemed to have substance, like stepping into a wall of black. The air that rolled out of the opening was thick with the smell of decay, damp earth and rust, and the faint musky scent of mice and rotten time. The smell of a place that had been sealed and forgotten. He fumbled for the small flashlight Ms. Dunham had tucked into the paper bag with the sandwich. Its thin beam cut a nervous path through the blackness. The interior was vast and empty, a cavernous space with a high arched ceiling that disappeared into shadow. The concrete floor was cracked and uneven. A few rotting wooden crates sat in one corner. A rusted oil drum stood near the far wall. A thick layer of dust and grime covered everything undisturbed for years. The corrugated metal walls were streaked with rust where rain had found its way through the seams. It wasn't a home. It was a crypt. Caleb dropped his duffel bag on the floor. The sound echoed in the huge space, bouncing off the curved walls and dying slowly. A wave of despair, cold and heavy, as lake water washed over him and settled in his chest. This was it. This was the brilliant plan. He had traded a warm bed in a place he hated for a concrete floor in a place that had already been forgotten by the world. $6 well spent. He sank down onto his bag. The flashlight beam trembled in his hand, casting jittery shadows on the wall. And for the first time since he had walked out of the group home, he felt the sting of tears. He wasn't crying for himself. He had stopped crying for himself years ago. He was crying for his grandfather, for the quiet, sad old man who had somehow ended up owning this miserable shed in the middle of nowhere. What kind of hope had Walter been clinging to? What was this place supposed to be? The tears dried. They always did. And when they were gone, what was left behind was not emptiness, but a cold, stubborn thing at the center of his chest. The same thing that had kept him going through 6 years of foster homes and group houses, and the slow grinding machinery of a system that processes children the way a factory processes parts. Not hope, something harder than hope. He unzipped his bag, pulled out the coat Ms. Dunham had given him, and laid down on the concrete floor with the duffel bag under his head. He was asleep within minutes. The exhaustion was bone deep, and even fear could not outrun it. The next few days were about survival, pure and simple. His first priority was shelter. The Quonset hut leaked cold air through a dozen gaps where the metal panels met the foundation. He spent hours stuffing rags and fistfuls of dry grass into the worst seams. He used a piece of scrap metal to patch the most obvious hole in the roof where a section of corrugation had rusted through completely. His work was crude, ugly, and imperfect, but each fix was a small victory against the elements. His second priority was water. The gas station was a 5-mile walk each way, and he couldn't do that every day. He found an old rain barrel behind the hut crusted with rust and dead leaves. He cleaned it out as best he could, positioned it under the patched section of the roof to catch runoff, and waited. On the third night it rained. He stood outside in the dark and listened to the water drumming on the metal roof and pouring into the barrel, and it sounded like the most beautiful music he had ever heard. His third priority was food. He had a little cash, the last of his meager savings from odd jobs at the group home. He made the long walk back to the crossroads and bought bread, peanut butter, canned beans, and a large jug of water from the same bored teenager behind the counter. It felt like a supply run for a mission on a desolate planet. He rationed everything, 2 meals a day, small portions, make it last. Living in the hut was a masterclass in discomfort. The days were tolerable, filled with the hard physical labor of trying to make the space habitable. He swept out years of accumulated filth, his throat raw from the dust. He fought a losing battle against the mice who considered the place their sovereign territory. He dragged the rotting crates outside and broke them down for kindling. But the nights were the worst. The cold seeped up from the concrete floor like something alive, a damp, persistent chill that got into his bones and stayed there. The wind howled around the curved metal walls, making the whole structure groan and shudder like a ship in a storm. In the absolute darkness, a darkness so complete that he couldn't see his hand in front of his face, every rustle, every creak, every skittering sound of mice across the floor sounded like a threat. He was more alone than he had ever been in his life. And in the group home, surrounded by other discarded children, he had been profoundly alone. This was something beyond that. This was the loneliness of a single human being on an empty plain under an empty sky with no one within miles who knew his name or cared whether he woke up in the morning. And yet, slowly, day by day, something began to shift. The physical work, as grueling as it was, gave him a focus he had never had before. His hands, soft from years of institutional idleness, became calloused and capable. He learned the rhythm of the place, the way the morning light came through the gap under the eastern wall and moved slowly across the floor like a golden clock hand, the way the temperature dropped exactly 45 minutes after sunset, the specific pitch of the wind that meant rain was coming. He was no longer just a visitor. He was becoming an inhabitant. The hut wasn't a home, not yet, maybe not ever, but it was his. He had earned it with sweat and cold nights and the stubborn refusal to quit. That was the only inheritance his years in the system had given him. It was during the second week that everything changed. He was trying to clear a space in the back of the hut for a more permanent sleeping area. The far corner was piled with rotted canvas tarps that smelled of mildew and mouse urine, and he was dragging them outside piece by piece, his arms aching from the work. When the last tarp came up, he stopped. Beneath it was a section of the concrete floor that didn't look right. It was a perfect square about 3 feet by 3 feet, and the seam around its edges was too clean, too deliberate. The rest of the floor was a disaster of cracks and upheaval and weather-damaged concrete that had heaved and settled and cracked again over decades. But this square was pristine. The seam around it was ruler straight, the gap barely wider than a credit card. Curiosity, a feeling he hadn't had much use for in years, sparked to life somewhere behind his ribs. He knelt down, running his fingers along the edge of the square. The concrete was smooth, almost polished. There was no handle, no ring to pull. It was perfectly flush with the surrounding floor. If you did not know to look for it, you would walk over it 1,000 times and never notice. He spent an hour trying to pry it up with a rusted tire iron he had found near the oil drum. The metal screeched against the concrete, but the slab didn't budge. It was sealed tight. Whatever mechanism held it in place was invisible, hidden beneath the surface. Frustrated, he sat back on his heels and shone the flashlight along the seam one more time, slowly, carefully, the way his grandfather used to examine things with patience, with attention to the small details that other people missed. And there it was, a tiny hole drilled into one corner of the slab. No bigger than the tip of a pencil. It wasn't a flaw. It wasn't damage. It was an access point. He remembered the notebooks. Walter was always sketching in those notebooks. Diagrams filled with hidden latches and clever mechanisms, springs and counterweights and release pins. Caleb had thought they were just the doodles of a bored old man. Now he understood. They were blueprints. This was his grandfather's work. He could feel it in the precision of the seam, the elegance of the hidden access point. Walter Mercer didn't just build things, he engineered them. Caleb didn't have a tool small enough to fit the hole. He walked the perimeter of the hut, his eyes scanning the floor, the walls, every corner and crack, looking for something. A stray nail, a piece of wire, anything with the right diameter. His gaze landed on the broken hasp from the main door. The pin that had held the padlock was still lodged in the rusted metal, a thick, sturdy piece of steel about the width of a pencil lead. He worked it free with his fingers bending and twisting until it came loose and carried it back to the square slab. He knelt down, lined the pin up with the hole, and pushed. At first, nothing. Then he leaned his weight into it, pressing harder, and there was a faint click from somewhere beneath the concrete. A mechanical sound. A release. His heart kicked against his ribs. He jammed the tire iron back into the seam and heaved. This time the slab moved. It lifted an inch, then two. It was incredibly heavy, far thicker than he had expected, at least 6 inches of solid reinforced concrete. With a final grunting effort, he pivoted the slab up and over. It tipped back and hit the floor behind it with a deep, heavy thud that shook the ground beneath his knees. A dark, square cavity opened beneath him. The air that rose up was cold and still and smelled of nothing. Not damp, not musty, just the absence of smell. The sterile, contained stillness of a space that had been sealed for a very long time. He shone the flashlight down into the hole. It wasn't a crawl space, it was a compartment lined with galvanized steel maybe 2 feet deep. And sitting inside it, nested on a bed of silica gel packets to absorb moisture, was a green military-style ammunition box. It was locked, but not with a padlock. The latch had a heavy-duty combination dial set into it, 3 numbers, the kind used on high-security equipment. A combination lock, of course. Walter Mercer wouldn't have made it easy. The man who designed hidden access points and concealed mechanisms, the man who built things to be found only by the right person, would never have left the final door unlocked. Caleb sat there for a long time staring at the dial, thinking, what number's a birthday? An address? He knew so little about his grandfather's life. The man had been a locked room unto himself. He tried his own birthday. Nothing. He tried Walter's, what he could remember of it. Nothing. He tried the address of the old house. Nothing. He was about to give up to try to force the lock open with a tire iron when a memory surfaced. Faint and distant, like a voice heard through a wall. He was 7 years old, maybe 8, sitting on his grandfather's lap in the living room of the old house, the one with the creaky floors and the workshop in the back. Walter was smoking his pipe, the sweet cherry tobacco smell filling the room, and he was pointing at a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. The photograph showed a small propeller plane sitting on a grass airstrip, its white paint gleaming in the sun. See that, Caleb? Walter had said, his voice a low, warm rumble that vibrated in his chest. That's a Skyhawk, model 172, best little plane ever made. He tapped the glass of the frame with one grease-stained finger. Never forget the number, son. 172, they'll take you places. Caleb had laughed and repeated the numbers like a game. 172, 172, a fragment of a conversation from a decade ago. A number said to a child who didn't understand its importance. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. His fingers trembled as he turned the dial. Right to 1, left past 1 to 7, right to 2. He pulled the latch. It clicked open. For a moment, he just knelt there, breathing hard. The air in the hut felt thick, charged with something electric, as though the building itself were holding its breath. Slowly, he lifted the heavy lid of the ammunition box. The contents were packed tightly, carefully, the way a man packs something he knows will not be opened for a very long time. On top was a large sealed envelope made of thick waxed paper, the kind designed to survive water and time and the slow decay of years. Beneath it, Caleb could see the edges of what looked like stacks of paper, a small leather-bound book, and a single heavy, old-fashioned brass key, the kind that belonged to a door that didn't exist in the modern world. He lifted the envelope out. His name was written on the front in his grandfather's handwriting. That spidery, precise script that leaned slightly to the right, each letter formed with the mechanical exactness of a man who spent his life drafting technical documents. Caleb. His hands shook as he broke the wax seal. Inside were several folded sheets of paper covered in that same familiar script. It was a letter. He took a deep breath and began to read. My dearest Caleb, if you are reading this, then it means 2 things. First, it means I am gone. For that, my boy, I am more sorry than you can ever know. I wanted to be there. I wanted to see you grow up. I wanted to teach you the things a grandfather is supposed to teach: how to fish, how to change a tire, how to shake a man's hand and look him in the eye. Second, it means you were clever enough to find this box. I knew you would be. You always had my eyes, Caleb. You see the things other people miss. He had to stop. He had to put the letter down and press the heels of his hands against his eyes and breathe. Walter's voice was so clear on the page, so impossibly present, that for one disorienting moment, Caleb felt the old man standing right behind him in the dark, looking over his shoulder. He picked the letter back up. I have not left you much, Caleb, not in the way the world measures wealth. This land, this ridiculous metal shed, they are a distraction, a shell. I had to make it look worthless, so no one would ever look too closely. The world is full of people who only see value in things they can sell. You and I were different. We know that some things are meant to be protected. The real inheritance is not this box. This is just the start. This Quonset hut is a lie, Caleb. A big, ugly metal lie designed to hide the truth. Beneath your feet is something else entirely. I built it for you. I built it for us. A place to be safe when the world gets loud. A place to weather the storm. The key in this box opens the door. The book has the coordinates, though. You are practically standing on top of it. Find the northwest corner of the foundation slab. 10 paces in, you'll find another surprise in the floor. Use the key. Go down, Caleb. Go down and see what I was really working on all those years. Be careful, be smart, and do not trust anyone who comes asking about this land. They are not your friends. More will be explained. This is just the first step. All my love, Gramps. He read the letter 3 times. His mind was reeling. A shell, a distraction, a place to be safe. What storm was he talking about? What was beneath the floor? He looked at the brass key, heavy and ornate in his palm. He looked at the leather-bound book. It was a surveyor's logbook, the kind used by engineers to record measurements and coordinates in the field. He flipped it open. The first page was filled with his grandfather's precise drawings, a hand-drawn map of the property with compass bearings and distances marked in neat figures. And in the northwest quadrant, a small X, exactly where the letter said it would be. Caleb grabbed the flashlight and the key and scrambled to his feet. His heart was a drum against his ribs. The northwest corner. 10 paces in, his boots echoed in the cavernous space as he walked, counting each step. The flashlight beam swung ahead of him like a lantern on a ship. 10 paces brought him to a section of floor that looked the same as everything around it, cracked, dusty, unremarkable. But this time he knew what to look for. He knelt and swept the dust away with his hands, working quickly, clearing a wide area. And there it was. Not a concrete square this time, but a heavy steel plate set flush with the floor. In the center of the plate was a single keyhole, fashioned built for the brass key in his pocket. It took all his strength to turn it. The mechanism resisted, frozen by years of disuse, and for a terrible moment he thought it wouldn't give. He gripped the key with both hands and twisted. Putting his whole body into it, there was a deep, resonant thud, not a surface sound, but something that came from far below. From deep in the earth, like the tumbler of a lock the size of a car, a mechanism had been released. He found the edge of the steel plate and pulled. The hatch was perfectly counterweighted. Despite its mass, it must have weighed 200 pounds. It rose up smoothly, silently, as though it were floating on air. His grandfather's engineering. Flawless even after all these years. Beneath the open hatch, a set of steep steel stairs descended into absolute blackness. A wave of cold, dry air washed over his face. It was different from the damp chill of the hut above. This was the sterile cold of a sealed space, a tomb, a vault, a room that had not tasted fresh air since the day it was closed. He hesitated at the top of the stairs. The flashlight beam cut a nervous, shaking path into the darkness below, illuminating the metal steps one at a time as they descended into nothing. His grandfather's words echoed in his head. Go down, Caleb. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and he went down. The stairs went straight down, about 15 feet steep and narrow, ending on a solid concrete floor. At the bottom, blocking the way forward, was a door. Not a regular door, a heavy steel door like one you'd see on a bank vault or the bulkhead of a warship. A large wheel was set in the center, a locking mechanism that required physical strength to turn. He gripped the wheel with both hands and put his shoulder into it. It resisted. Then it gave way with a series of loud, satisfying clicks that echoed up the stairwell. He pulled the door open. It swung inward on massive hinges without a sound, and Caleb Mercer stepped into another world. It wasn't a cellar, it wasn't a crawl space, it was a bunker, a small, impeccably constructed underground shelter. The walls were smooth, poured concrete, clean and dry. A single bare bulb overhead hummed to life as the door opened, triggered by a contact switch, casting a low yellow light over the space. It was one long room, maybe 40 feet by 8, roughly the dimensions of a shipping container. Along one wall, steel shelves were neatly stacked with canned goods, medical supplies, and boxes of military MREs in sealed packaging. A water tank with a hand pump and a filtration system stood in the corner. A folding cot leaned against the wall, still wrapped in plastic. On the opposite side of the room was a desk, a real solid oak desk, the kind of furniture that belongs in a study or a library not 20 feet underground in a concrete box. On its surface sat a ham radio set, more of Walter's notebooks stacked in neat piles, and another metal ammunition box identical to the first but larger. Caleb walked through the space in a daze, running his hand along the cool concrete wall. Everything was dry. Everything was intact. The air was stale but breathable, filtered, he realized, by a passive ventilation system built into the walls, its intake disguised somewhere above ground. This was what Walter had been doing all those years. This was what the workshop behind the house had really been for. Not a hobby, not the eccentricity of a lonely old man. This was a fortress, an ark built with the same precision and care that Walter brought to everything he touched. But why and what was he so afraid of? The sadness Caleb had always seen in his grandfather's eyes, that permanent weight, that shadow suddenly felt different. Not melancholy, not grief, fear. A deep, abiding fear that had lived in Walter Mercer for decades and driven him underground. Caleb's attention was drawn back to the desk, to the second box. This one had no lock, just two simple latches. He flipped them open and lifted the lid. The contents knocked the air from his lungs. It wasn't tools, it wasn't supplies, it was paper. Stacks and stacks of documents, memos, lab reports, geological surveys, internal correspondence, all on official letterhead from a company called Vantage Chemical. And on top of it all, another sealed envelope, thicker than the first, addressed to him in Walter's handwriting. Caleb sat down in the old wooden chair at the desk, the very chair his grandfather must have sat in night after night, alone in this concrete room 20 feet below the earth, surrounded by the evidence of a crime he couldn't prove and a guilt he couldn't escape. He opened the second letter. Leo, if you're here in this room, then you found my sanctuary, my confessional. I hope it serves you better than it served me. I called it the Ark, but I was never able to save the people who really needed it. I have a confession to make, son, a sin to confess. For 30 years, I was a geological engineer for Vantage Chemical, a big company. My job was to survey sites for industrial development to make sure the ground was stable and suitable. It was a good job. It paid well. It let me raise your father in a nice house and put food on the table. But I was a coward, Caleb. I saw things I should have spoken up about, and I stayed quiet because I was scared of losing my job, scared of uprooting my family, scared of being the man who makes trouble. Vantage had a subsidiary waste disposal unit. They were cheap and they were reckless. For a decade, they cut corners. Instead of properly treating and disposing of toxic byproducts from their chemical plants, they buried them. Barrels of poison right in the ground. And I was the one who signed off on the geological reports. I certified that those sites were suitable for inert material storage. That's what they told me. Inert material. I was willfully blind. By the time I realized what was really happening, it was too late. I was complicit. The place where you are sitting now, Caleb Harlan Flats, was one of the worst sites. This whole area is a toxic sponge. The chemicals are in the soil. They're in the water table. They're in the air. The company folded the disposal subsidiary, buried the records, and walked away. They left a time bomb ticking under the feet of every family living here. Caleb's blood went cold. The chemical smell in the air, the faint bitterness he had noticed the first night. The diner that was permanently closed. The population sign that seemed impossibly high for the ghost town he had walked through. His stomach turned. I quit my job. I tried to go to the authorities. The EPA. the State Environmental Board. But Vantage's lawyers were better than my evidence. They discredited me. They painted me as a disgruntled, unstable former employee. They buried me in litigation until I had nothing left. No savings, no reputation, no credibility. Your grandmother left me. I don't blame her. I had become someone she didn't recognize. Your father tried to stand by me, but I pushed him away. I was toxic, Caleb, in every sense of the word. The guilt, it ate me alive. When your parents died in that car crash, I knew it was a kind of judgment. I had failed everyone I ever loved. He had to put the letter down. His hands were shaking too hard to hold the paper still. The car crash. Walter had always made it sound like a simple, tragic accident. But the way he wrote about it, a kind of judgment, opened a door in Caleb's mind that he wasn't ready to walk through. Not yet. He looked at the stacks of documents in the box, the Vantage chemical letterhead, the geological surveys, the shipping manifests, decades of evidence gathered piece by piece by a man with nothing left but his guilt and his determination. After a few minutes, he picked the letter back up. I spent the rest of my life trying to build a case. Every penny I had left went into this. I bought this land under a different name. I built this bunker with my own two hands. I gathered the proof, the original survey maps I falsified under duress, the shipping manifests I copied, the internal memos I smuggled out. It's all in this box, Caleb. The truth. But I was one old man, running out of time, and I knew they hadn't forgotten. Recently, a new company, a real estate firm called Crestline Properties, started buying up land all around Harlan Flats. Quietly, making generous offers. But Crestline is just another named son. I checked their corporate filings. They are a wholly owned subsidiary of Vantage Chemical. They're not here to build homes. They're here to bury their sins for good. To acquire every last acre and lock it down so that no one ever digs deep enough to find what's underneath. They will come for this land, Caleb. They will make you an offer. They will offer you more money than you have ever dreamed of, enough to go anywhere, start a new life, and forget this place ever existed. Inside this box, beneath the documents, you will find my last secret. It is what's left of my pension, my life savings. Cash. I called it my fight money. It's not enough to make you rich, but it's enough to live on for a while. Or it's enough to hire a lawyer, enough to start the fight I could never finish. The choice is yours, my boy. You owe this place nothing. You owe me nothing. You can take the money and run. No one would blame you. God knows you've earned a quiet life. Or you can stay. You can use what I've left you. You can be the man I never had the courage to be. You can bring the truth to light. It will be hard. It will be dangerous. They will fight you with everything they have. But it is the right thing to do. The harder right. Whatever you choose, know that I loved you. Know that in the end, all I wanted was for you to be safe and to be proud of the name you carry. Your loving grandfather, Walter Caleb, lowered the letter slowly. His mind was a storm, grief and anger, and a terrifying, crushing weight of responsibility, all spinning together in the silence of the bunker. He reached into the box, past the files, past the stacks of documents. His fingers found something wrapped in oilcloth at the very bottom. He pulled it out. It was heavy. He unwrapped the cloth. Bricks of cash, $100 bills bound in thick rubber bands packed tight. He didn't count them, but it was more money than he had ever seen in his life. More money than he had ever imagined touching. The fight money, his ticket out, or his ticket in. He sat there in the silence of the ark. The hum of the single light bulb was the only sound. The concrete walls pressed in around him like the walls of a coffin or maybe a cradle. He couldn't tell the difference. He thought about the group home, the gray walls, the fluorescent lights, the feeling of being invisible, of being a number in a system that would forget him before the week was out. He could take this money and be someone else. Tomorrow. He could buy a bus ticket to California. He could rent a room. He could eat in restaurants. He could disappear into the vast, anonymous machinery of America and never think about Harlan Flats or Vantage Chemical or his grandfather's guilt ever again. He could be free. Then he thought about Walter, the quiet, sad man who smelled of pipe smoke and motor oil, who spent his nights alone in this concrete room 20 feet beneath the earth, poring over evidence of a crime that no one believed was real. Who built this place with his own hands, not as a hobby, not as a hiding place, but as a vault for the truth? A man who spent his last years consumed by a mistake he made in his 30s, trying to atone for it with the only tools he had left: patience and precision and love. This bunker, this box, this letter. It wasn't an inheritance, it was a baton, passed from one generation to the next. The race wasn't over. Walter had simply run as far as he could. And now he was asking his grandson, the only person left in the world who carried his name, to pick it up and keep running. Caleb looked at the money. He looked at the documents. He looked at the letter in his hand. Then he folded the letter carefully, slid it back into its envelope, and placed it on the desk beside the radio. He didn't count the money. He didn't look at the documents again. Not tonight. Tonight he just sat there in the chair in the silence, in the low yellow light, and let the weight of it settle onto his shoulders. It was enormous. It was terrifying. But for the first time in his life, it felt like his own. The black SUV came on a Tuesday morning. Caleb heard it before he saw it, the low growl of an engine that didn't belong out here, a sound too smooth and expensive for the gravel track that passed for a road. He was outside the Quonset, shirtless in the early sun, splitting a rotten crate into kindling with the back of the tire iron. His hands were blistered and his shoulders ached, and the sweat on his skin had already begun to cool in the morning air. He had been awake since before dawn. He had not slept well since reading his grandfather's letter. He had not slept well at all. He straightened up and watched the vehicle approach. It moved slowly, deliberately, raising a thin curtain of dust behind it. It was black and polished and utterly out of place against the backdrop of dead weeds and rusted barbed wire and flat, empty earth. The kind of vehicle that belonged in the parking garage of a downtown office tower, not on a dirt road in the middle of Harlan Flats. It stopped 30 feet from the hut. The engine idled for a moment, then cut off. The silence rushed back in. A man got out. He was tall, mid-50s, with silver hair combed back from a tanned forehead, and a suit that cost more than everything Caleb had ever owned combined. His shoes were polished to a mirror finish and entirely wrong for the terrain. He picked his way across the dirt with the careful steps of someone who considered the ground beneath him an inconvenience. His smile arrived before he did. It was wide-eyed and white, and practiced the smile of a man who had closed 1,000 deals across 1,000 conference tables and believed that every human interaction was simply a negotiation waiting to be won. His eyes told a different story. They were pale and flat and moved quickly, scanning the hut, the land, the boy standing in front of it with a tire iron in his hand. They were the eyes of a man who was measuring. "Caleb Mercer," he said, extending his hand. His voice was smooth and warm and entirely empty. "My name is Holloway. I represent Crestline Properties. We're a development firm with significant interests in this region." Caleb did not take his hand. He let it hang there in the space between them, and after a moment Holloway withdrew it without losing a fraction of his smile. "We've been trying to reach the owner of this parcel for some time," Holloway continued, as though the refused handshake had never happened. "I must say it's a pleasure to finally put a face to the name. Young man like yourself out here all alone, that takes a certain kind of courage." "What do you want?" Caleb said. Holloway glanced at the Quonset hut with unconcealed disdain. His gaze traveled slowly over the patched roof, the rust-streaked walls, the weeds growing up through the cracked foundation at the edges. He looked at it the way a man looks at a dead animal on the side of the road, with distaste and with the quiet satisfaction of knowing he would never be in that position. "I want to help you, Caleb. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for your property." He said the word property like it tasted bad. "My clients are authorized to offer you $250,000. The number hung in the air between them like a held breath. $250,000 for a rusting tin shed on a patch of poisoned dirt, for a boy who had been eating peanut butter sandwiches for 2 weeks and sleeping on a concrete floor. It was a fortune. It was more money than Caleb had ever conceived of possessing. It was the easy way out, gift-wrapped, hand-delivered, placed in front of him, like a plate of food set before a starving man. Everything his grandfather had said would happen was happening, word for word. The letter had been a prophecy, and here was its fulfillment, standing in a $1,000 suit with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's a fresh start," Holloway said. His voice dropped half a register, becoming intimate, conspiratorial, as though they were old friends sharing a secret. A new life, anywhere you want. You're 18 years old, Caleb. You could go to college, you could see the world. You could leave all of this behind and never look back. He gestured around at the dirt, at the emptiness, at the nothing. Caleb could see the path fork in front of him. Two roads clear as day, one led away from here to a quiet, comfortable, anonymous life in some city where no one knew his name and no one cared where he came from. A life where Harlan Flats was just a place he used to know, a footnote in a story he never told. The other road led right back here, to this patch of ground and the secret buried beneath it in a fight he had no idea how to win. He thought about the families his grandfather had written about. The people who lived on this land, drinking this water, breathing this air, never knowing the poison that was seeping up through the soil beneath their feet. He thought about Walter alone in the bunker night after night, surrounded by evidence that no one would look at, carrying a guilt that no one would share. He looked Holloway in the eye. "I know who you are," he said. His voice was low and steady. It did not shake. "I know what Vantage Chemical is, and I know what's buried under this land." Something shifted behind Holloway's eyes, a flicker. The smile remained, but the warmth drained out of it like water from a cracked glass. "The answer is no," Caleb said. "Now get off my property." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to stop. Holloway studied him for a long moment. He looked at the boy, 18 years old, sunburned, standing in the dirt in front of a metal shed with a tire iron in his hand, and for the first time his expression changed. The salesman disappeared. What replaced him was something colder and more honest. He was recalculating. He was seeing, perhaps for the first time, not a transaction, but a problem. "You're making a very big mistake, son," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. The warmth was gone entirely. "No," Caleb said. He felt a strange calm settling over him, a stillness at his center that he had never felt before. "I'm just getting started." Holloway stared at him for another beat. Then he turned without a word, got back into the SUV, and pulled the door shut. The engine started, the vehicle reverse turned, and drove away down the gravel track, leaving a cloud of pale dust hanging in the air. Caleb stood there until the sound of the engine faded to nothing. Until the silence of Harlan Flats rushed back in to fill the void, vast and patient and complete. His heart was pounding, his hands were shaking, but his feet were planted. He wasn't going anywhere. He did not call for help immediately. This was important. This was the thing that mattered, though he couldn't have explained it at the time. In the days after Holloway's visit, Caleb did not pick up the phone and dial Ms. Dunham. He did not search for a lawyer. He did not reach out to a reporter or a government agency or anyone at all. Instead, he went underground. Every night after the sun set and the temperature dropped and the hut became a cathedral of wind and shadow, he descended the steel stairs into the ark, pulled the heavy door shut behind him, and sat down at his grandfather's desk. And he read everything. He started with the geological surveys, dense technical documents filled with soil composition data and groundwater flow maps and chemical analysis tables that meant nothing to him at first. He read them twice, 3 times, 4 times, looking up terms he didn't know, cross-referencing figures, teaching himself the language of the enemy. He read the internal memos from Vantage Chemical, written in the bloodless corporate prose of men who discuss the burial of toxic waste the way other men discuss quarterly earnings. He read the shipping manifest's long columned lists of barrel counts and chemical codes and destination coordinates, each one corresponding to a site where Vantage had dumped its poison into the earth. And he read his grandfather's journals. The leather-bound logbooks weren't just surveyor's notebooks. They were diaries. Walter had used them to chronicle his guilt, his fear, his painstaking efforts to build a case that no one wanted to hear. The handwriting changed over the years, starting neat and precise in the early entries, growing tighter and more erratic as the decades passed, as though the pen itself were bearing down harder under the weight of what it had to say. Walter wrote about the local families he had watched get sick. He wrote about the strange cancers that appeared in clusters, leukemia, lymphoma, rare tumors in children who should have been healthy. He wrote about the wells that went foul, the livestock that died, the gardens that stopped growing. He wrote their names down, every single one. He mourned them on the page the way a man mourns at a graveside, with the private, inarticulate sorrow of someone who knows he is partly responsible for the thing he is grieving. Caleb read all of it. It took him 9 days, 9 nights in the bunker under the hum of the single light bulb at the desk where his grandfather had sat before him. By the end, his eyes were red and his back ached and his mind was dense with information. But something had changed inside him. He understood. Not just the facts were clear enough, damning enough, but the shape of the thing, the architecture of the crime, how it was committed, how it was hidden, how the machinery of corporate power was used to silence the one man who tried to speak. He understood because he had done the work himself. He had not waited for someone to explain it to him. He had not asked for permission or guidance or help. He had sat down in the dark and taught himself the truth page by page, document by document, the way his grandfather had gathered that truth in the first place. And only then, only when he felt the full weight and dimension of what he was carrying, did he walk the 5 miles to the gas station and pick up the payphone. The receiver was cold and greasy against his ear. The gas station hummed with the sound of a refrigerator unit and the low buzz of a fly trapped against the window. Outside, the sun was already high, bleaching the road white. He dialed the number Miss Dunham had written on the back of her business card. It rang 4 times. 5. He was about to hang up when the line clicked. Sarah Dunham. It's Caleb. A pause. He could hear the faint sound of an office in the background, the murmur of voices, the clatter of a keyboard. A world away. He told her everything. He told her about the bunker, the letters, the documents. He told her about Vantage Chemical and the decades of buried waste. He told her about the geological surveys and the shipping manifests and the names in his grandfather's journals. He told her about Holloway and the offer and the cold look in the man's eyes when Caleb said no. He expected her to tell him he was crazy. He expected her to tell him to take the money and run the way any reasonable adult would tell a homeless 18-year-old to take $250,000 and disappear. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Ms. Dunham spoke, and her voice was different. The professional neutrality, the carefully maintained distance that was both her armor and her tool was gone. What replaced it was something he had never heard from her before. A tone of steel, of resolve, of recognition. Caleb, she said, stay put. Don't talk to anyone else. Don't let anyone onto that property. I'm going to make a call. She didn't say who she was calling. She didn't explain. She just told him she would be in touch and to keep the bunker locked. He walked back to the hut feeling something he hadn't felt since the night he opened his grandfather's box. A sliver of hope, thin and fragile, but real. He wasn't entirely alone in this. A week later, the beat-up pickup truck came rattling up the gravel track. It was the opposite of Holloway's SUV in every possible way, old dented, mud splattered, with a cracked windshield and a tailgate held shut with bungee cord. It looked like it had driven through every back road in 3 states and survived out of sheer stubbornness. The woman who got out matched the truck. She was in her late 20s with tired eyes, a jaw set like a fist, and dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail that suggested she had more important things to think about than appearances. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt and boots that had actually been used for walking on dirt. She stood next to her truck and looked around at the hut, at the land, at the sky with the slow, assessing gaze of someone cataloging facts. Then she looked at Caleb. Caleb Mercer. Who's asking, he said. His hand rested on the tire iron near the door. He had learned caution. It was a fast education. Nora Belwick, she said. She pulled a worn business card from her back pocket and held it out. I'm an attorney. Sarah Dunham sent me. The card was simple. White stock, black ink, no embossing, no firm logo. Just a name, a title, and a phone number. Nora Belwick, SQ. Environmental and Community Law. She wasn't from a big firm. She wasn't from any firm as far as he could tell. She looked as overworked and underfunded as he felt. She was in every visible way the opposite of the army of polished lawyers that Vantage Chemical would send against them. She was perfect. He let her in. For the next 5 hours, he showed her everything. He led her down into the ark, and he watched her face change as she stepped through the vault door and took in the scope of what Walter Mercer had built. He handed her the letters, and she read them standing up, leaning against the concrete wall, her lips pressed together in a thin line. He opened the document box, and she knelt on the floor and spread the papers out around her in careful rows, her sharp eyes moving from page to page without a word. She read the geological surveys. She read the shipping manifests. She cross-referenced the internal memos with the dates on the falsified reports. She did it quickly and methodically, the way a surgeon reads a chart before an operation, looking for the things that would determine whether the patient lived or died. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "Your grandfather built an airtight case," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost reverent. "These original manifests, the internal memos admitting they knew this is the smoking gun they thought they'd buried forever." "So we can win?" Caleb asked. The word tasted like something he had never been allowed to eat. Nora looked at him. Her expression was serious, careful, the expression of a woman who had learned the hard way that false hope is more dangerous than no hope at all. "Caleb, winning isn't a single event. This isn't a movie where the good guys make one great speech and the judge slams his gavel and it's over. Vantage Chemical has an army of lawyers. They have resources we can't begin to match. They will try to bury us in motions, in discovery requests, in procedural delays. They will try to bankrupt us. They will try to discredit you the same way they discredited your grandfather. This will be a long, ugly, brutal fight. It could take years." "I have money," Caleb said. He gestured toward the oilcloth bundle in the box. "My grandfather left it. He called it his fight money." She nodded slowly. "That helps. It'll keep the lights on for a while. But it won't be enough to match them dollar for dollar. Not even close." "Then what's our advantage?" Nora tapped the stack of documents on the floor. "This, the evidence. It's clean, it's comprehensive, and it's been preserved perfectly. And you." She looked at him steadily. "The story. A kid who aged out of the system, inherited a worthless piece of land, and found his grandfather's life's work buried underground. That's not just a legal case, Caleb. That's a narrative. People will listen to that." "I don't want to be a story," he said. "I want to be a problem." For the first time, Nora Belwick smiled. It was brief and sharp, like a knife catching the light. "Good," she said. "Then let's get started." The legal machinery began to turn. Nora filed a preliminary injunction to prevent Crestline Properties from making further attempts to acquire land in the Harlan Flats area. She used Walter's corporate filings as the ones proving that Crestline was a wholly owned subsidiary of Vantage Chemical as the basis, arguing that the acquisitions were part of a coordinated effort to suppress evidence of environmental contamination. Simultaneously, she filed a lawsuit against Vantage Chemical on behalf of the land itself, a legal strategy she called a public trust claim. The argument was that Vantage had violated its duty to the public and the environment by knowingly contaminating the soil and groundwater of an entire community and then systematically concealing the damage for decades. They weren't suing for money alone. They were suing for remediation of full-scale environmental cleanup of Harlan Flats paid for by the company that had poisoned it. It was an ambitious play. Nora told him that up front. "We're swinging for the fences because we have one shot. If we aim small, they'll settle us into silence. If we aim big, we make it impossible for them to hide." Vantage's response was swift and predictable in its brutality. They filed a motion to dismiss, claiming the statute of limitations had expired years ago. They filed a countersuit against Caleb personally for defamation, seeking damages that would have bankrupted a corporation, let alone an 18-year-old with no income and no assets beyond a tin shed. They dispatched a team of attorneys, 4 of them in matching dark suits with matching leather briefcases, to the small county courthouse in Harlan Flats, a building that had probably never seen more than 2 lawyers at the same time in its entire history. Their lead counsel was a man named Garrett Stokes, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with a voice like polished oak, and the quiet confidence of someone who had never lost a case that mattered. He moved through the courthouse like he owned it, nodding to the clerk, shaking hands with the judge's secretary, radiating the easy authority of a man who understood that power is not something you claim, it's something you assume and wait for others to confirm. Caleb watched him from across the courtroom and felt for the first time since this began the full dimension of what he was up against. This wasn't a fight between right and wrong. It was a fight between a boy with a box of papers and a machine designed to crush people exactly like him. But Nora was something he hadn't expected. She was not loud. She was not theatrical. She didn't pace or gesture or raise her voice. She stood at her table with her notes in a plain manila folder and spoke in clear, precise sentences, each one laid down like a brick in a wall she was building, one row at a time. She argued that the statute of limitations clock should not have started until the evidence was actually discoverable, which was the moment Caleb opened the ammunition box in the Quonset hut. The contamination was ongoing. The concealment was ongoing. The harm was ongoing. The clock, she said, had barely begun to tick. It was a good argument, good enough to keep them in the game. The judge denied Vantage's motion to dismiss, temporarily, provisionally. But it was enough. The community came slowly, the way water finds a crack in stone. Mrs. Tierney was the first. She was 73 years old with white hair and hands that trembled slightly when she held them still. Her husband Frank had died of leukemia 4 years ago. He had been a well driller. A man who spent his life putting pipes into the ground and pulling water out of it. The water that, as Walter Mercer's documents now showed, had been contaminated with industrial solvents for over a decade. She came to the Quonset one afternoon driving a car that was older than Caleb, carrying a cardboard box under one arm. She didn't knock. There was no door to knock on. She just stood at the opening of the hut and called out his name. "Caleb Mercer, I'm Ruth Tierney. My husband was Frank Tierney. I hear you've been asking questions about the water." He hadn't been asking questions. He hadn't spoken to anyone in the community at all. But in a town of 400 people, news travels the way heat travels through metal, quickly, silently through contact. She set the box on the floor of the hut and opened it. Inside were photographs of her husband, medical records, a death certificate, lab results from the hospital in the city that had treated Frank during his final months, showing chemical markers in his blood that were consistent with long-term exposure to trichloroethylene, one of the primary compounds listed in Vantage's shipping manifests. "The doctors said it was just bad luck," Mrs. Tierney said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "They said sometimes these things just happen. But Frank was healthy his whole life. He didn't smoke. He didn't drink. He ate right, and he worked hard, and he drank the water from the well he dug himself." She looked at Caleb with eyes that were clear and dry and full of a fury that had been burning for 4 years with no place to go. "It wasn't bad luck," she said. "Was it?" "No, ma'am," Caleb said. "It wasn't." After Mrs. Tierney, others came. A farmer named Hardin, whose well had gone foul 3 years ago, the water turning brown and smelling of something sharp and chemical that he couldn't identify. He'd filed a complaint with the county. The county had sent someone to test the water. The results, he was told, were within acceptable limits. He never saw the actual report. Then a young mother named Jessie Crane, who drove 30 miles to see Caleb because her 5-year-old son had been diagnosed with a kidney condition that the pediatrician in the city had called rare and unexplained. She brought a Ziploc bag full of dirt from her backyard because she didn't know what else to bring. She just knew something was wrong. One by one they came, not in a flood but in a trickle, hesitant, scared, skeptical. They had been beaten down for a long time, these people. They had watched their towns shrink and their neighbors sicken and their complaints disappear into the bureaucratic void. They had been told over and over by people in positions of authority that there was nothing wrong, that the water was fine, that the soil was fine, that Harlan Flats was just a dying town in a dying part of the country, and if people were getting sick, well, that was just the way things were. But now there was a boy in a tin shed with a box full of proof that said otherwise. And the names in his grandfather's journals, the names Walter had written down with such care, such sorrow, were their names. Their parents' names, their children's names. The hut became a meeting place. Not a formal one. There were no chairs, no agenda, no schedule. People just came when they could. They brought what they had. Medical records, water samples, photographs, stories. They sat on the concrete floor or leaned against the metal walls and told Caleb what had happened to their families. And he listened to every word and wrote it all down in a new notebook he had bought at the gas station, a cheap spiral-bound thing that he filled with the same careful handwriting his grandfather had used. He was becoming, without intending, to the center of something. Not because he was the strongest or the smartest or the most experienced person in the room. He was none of those things. He was the center because he was the only one with nothing to lose. Everyone else had jobs and mortgages and children and the 1,000 small anchors that keep a person tethered to the life they know, even when that life is slowly killing them. Caleb had nothing. He had a tin shed and a bunker and a box of documents and the stubborn, unreasonable refusal to walk away. That, it turned out, was enough. The retaliation began 2 weeks after the lawsuit was filed. Caleb came back from a supply run to find the Quonset hut torn apart. The sliding door had been forced open. His sleeping area was destroyed. The cot overturned, his duffel bag slashed, his few possessions scattered across the floor. The wooden crates he had been using as shelves were smashed. Someone had gone through the space methodically searching for something. They hadn't found the bunker. The hatch was undisturbed, the steel plate still flush with the floor, invisible under the layer of dust and grit that Caleb had learned to spread over it each morning. Walter's design had held. The secret was safe, but the message was clear. Then the phone call started. Every time Caleb walked to the gas station to use the payphone, his only link to Nora and Ms. Dunham and the outside world, the phone would ring before he could pick it up. And on the other end, a voice. Never the same voice twice, but always the same tone. Flat, controlled, professional. Walk away, kid. Take what you can get and walk away. You don't know what you're doing. You're going to get hurt. Your grandfather was a crazy old man. Don't end up like him. He never responded. He would hang up the receiver and stand there for a moment, his pulse hammering, and then he would pick the phone back up and make his call. But the fear was real. It lived in his chest like a second heartbeat. And at night, alone in the bunker with the vault doors sealed, he would lie on the cot and listen to the silence and wonder if this was how his grandfather had felt. Every single night, for years. There were vehicles too. A car he didn't recognize, parked on the road about a quarter-mile from his property, sitting there for hours with its engine off. It was there one morning and gone the next, and there again 2 days later. Someone was watching. Someone was keeping track. Nora told him to document everything, photograph the break-in damage, record the dates and times of the phone calls, note the license plate of the parked car, build a record. They're trying to scare you, she said over the phone. Her voice was calm but hard. That's good news, believe it or not. Scared people don't bother intimidating someone they think is going to lose. They're doing this because they know those documents are real, and they're terrified of what happens when a judge sees them. Caleb started sleeping in the bunker full-time. He would seal the hatch from the inside each night, descending into the quiet, sterile safety of the Ark, the way a sailor descends into the hold of a ship before a storm. The concrete walls were thick. The air was filtered. The vault door could stop a battering ram. Down here, the threats couldn't reach him. Down here, he was safe. But safety wasn't the same as peace. And at night, in the yellow light of the single bulb, he would sit at Walter's desk and open the journals and read the old man's words and feel the weight of 2 generations of solitude pressing down on him like earth on a coffin. The deposition took place in the county courthouse on a Wednesday morning in October. The room was small and windowless, with a long table and a court reporter and too many lawyers. Garrett Stokes sat across from Caleb with a legal pad and a fountain pen and the serene, unhurried expression of a man who had done this 1,000 times. Nora sat beside Caleb with her manila folder and her jaw set tight. Stokes began gently. That was the worst part. He was courteous, almost fatherly, his deep voice radiating the warm concern of a man who genuinely cared about the welfare of the young person sitting before him. It was a performance, and it was flawless. Caleb, I want to make sure you understand that no one here is trying to attack you or your grandfather's memory. We're simply trying to establish the facts. You understand that? Yes, sir. Good. Now, your grandfather, Walter Mercer, he was a man who lived alone for many years. A man who, by his own account, suffered from significant personal and professional setbacks. Would you say that's accurate? He was a man who tried to tell the truth and was punished for it. Stokes smiled. It was a patient smile. The smile of a teacher correcting a bright but misguided student. He built an underground bunker on an isolated piece of land. He stockpiled food and water and supplies. He believed that a major corporation was engaged in a vast conspiracy to poison an entire community. Is that a fair summary? He didn't believe it. He documented it. With materials he claims to have removed from his former employer. With materials he had every right to retain as the engineer of record on those surveys. That's a matter of legal interpretation, Caleb. What isn't a matter of interpretation is the behavior, the isolation, the secrecy, the bunker. These are not the actions of a well man. The room was quiet. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys. So your position, Stokes continued, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conversational register, is that your grandfather, a man who was dismissed from his job, who lost his wife, who was estranged from his son, who spent his final years alone underground, was not a paranoid, troubled individual, but a heroic whistleblower. Caleb looked at him. He didn't look at Nora. He didn't look at the court reporter or the other lawyers or the fluorescent lights humming overhead. He looked directly at Garrett Stokes into the pale, intelligent eyes of a man who was paid more per hour than Caleb had ever earned in a year, and he spoke. My grandfather built that bunker because he knew people like you would try to bury the truth. And he was right. Because that is exactly what you're doing right now in this room with that question. A flicker behind Stokes's eyes. The smile held, but something shifted beneath it. He left me a map, Caleb continued. His voice was steady. He left me a choice. He knew Vantage would send someone to offer me money. He knew you would offer me an easy life. And he trusted me, a kid he hadn't seen in 7 years, a kid who'd been ground up by the foster system. He trusted me to choose the hard road, because he knew I was the only one left who would. The court reporter typed. The room was silent. My grandfather wasn't paranoid, Mr. Stokes. He was right, and you know it. That's why you're sitting in this room trying to make him sound crazy instead of answering for what your client did. Stokes looked at him for a long time. Something moved behind his eyes, not respect exactly, but recognition. The recognition that the boy across the table was not what he had expected. Not a charity case, not a prop, not a frightened teenager who could be rattled into contradiction. He was Walter Mercer's grandson, and he had read every document in that box. No further questions at this time, Stokes said. He closed his legal pad. The story broke 3 days later. A reporter from the county paper, a woman named Linda Cross, who had been covering municipal meetings and school board elections for 15 years and had never written anything that made anyone outside of Harlan Flats pay attention, picked up the story. She called Nora. She came to the courthouse. She read the filings, and she wrote a piece with a headline that traveled further than anything that had ever come out of that town. Aged out at 18, foster youth finds grandfather's underground bunker and a corporate secret worth millions. A regional paper picked it up the next day. Then a wire service. Within a week, the story of the boy in the Quonset hut had traveled from the local section to the front page. Not because the legal case was won, it wasn't not by a long way, but because the story itself was irresistible. A kid with nothing fighting a company with everything. A grandfather's last message from beyond the grave. A bunker full of secrets under a tin shed in the middle of nowhere. People read it. People shared it. People cared. And in the boardroom of Vantage Chemicals, somewhere in a glass tower in a city 1,000 miles from Harlan Flats, people noticed. Their next move was their most dangerous. Vantage's legal team filed an emergency motion with the court arguing that the documents in Caleb's possession, the geological surveys, the shipping manifests, the internal memos were proprietary corporate property that had been illegally removed by a former employee. They demanded that the court issue an order for the immediate seizure of all materials currently held on the Mercer property to be placed in the custody of Vantage Chemicals' legal department for review. If the motion succeeded, the evidence would be in Vantage's hands. And once it was in their hands, it would disappear. Legally, cleanly, permanently. They would review it, classify it as privileged, and seal it. The documents Walter Mercer had spent his life gathering the proof of a crime that had poisoned an entire community would vanish into a corporate vault and never see the light of day. Everything Caleb had fought for, everything his grandfather had died trying to protect, gone. Nora called him that night. Her voice was controlled, but he could hear the strain beneath it. They filed a seizure motion. It's aggressive even for them. The hearing is in 10 days. Can they do that? They can try. The argument is that Walter took those documents without authorization when he left the company. If the judge agrees that they're stolen corporate property, then yes, legally they can take them. Caleb sat on the floor of the Quonset, his back against the cold metal wall, the phone pressed to his ear, and he felt the ground shifting beneath him. Everything he had, the only weapon he possessed, was a box of paper, and they were coming for it. So what do? He asked. We fight, Nora said. We fight the motion. We argue that those documents aren't corporate property. They're the personal records of a professional engineer who had a legal right to retain copies of reports he authored and signed. And we argue that even if they were taken improperly, the public interest in their disclosure outweighs any proprietary claim. She paused. It's going to be close, Caleb. I won't lie to you, this could go either way. He hung up the phone and stood in the dark. Above him, the curved roof of the Quonset creaked in the wind. Below his feet, sealed behind a steel hatch in a vault door, sat the evidence that his grandfather had given his life to collect. 10 days. 10 days to save the truth or watch it be buried for good. He walked back to the hut. He opened the hatch. He descended the stairs. He sealed the vault door behind him and sat down at the desk where his grandfather had sat, in the chair where his grandfather had sat under the same bare bulb that had burned through all those long, lonely nights. And he opened the journals, not to read them again. He had read them. He knew every word. He opened them to look for something specific, something Walter might have written that would prove these documents were his to keep. A note, a reference, a detail about how and why he had retained them. The answer, if it existed, was somewhere in these pages. And Caleb Mercer, the boy who had taught himself the architecture of a corporate crime by reading alone in an underground room, was not about to stop now. He picked up a pencil, turned to the first page, and began. He found it on the seventh night. Page after page of Walter's journals, read and reread under the hum of the single bulb, the pencil in his hand marking passages and cross-referencing dates, building a timeline of his grandfather's thinking, the way an archaeologist rebuilds a skeleton, bone by bone, fragment by fragment, until the shape of the thing becomes undeniable. The entry was dated 11 years before Caleb was born. The handwriting was still neat in those early pages, still steady, the script of a man who had not yet been broken by what he knew. I have been thinking about the reports. My reports. The ones I signed. Legally, my signature on those surveys makes them my professional work product. They are not Vantage's property. They are the documented professional opinions of a licensed geological engineer. The company paid me to produce them, but the opinions are mine. The license is mine. The liability, if those opinions are ever shown to be false, is mine. I have begun keeping copies. Not of their internal documents, I have no right to those, but of my own work, my surveys, my field notes, my signed assessments. These are the records of my professional practice, and I am entitled to retain them under the State Engineering Board's Code of Conduct, Section 14.3, Retention of Professional Records. If this ever goes to court, I will need to prove that I knew, that I signed reports I knew to be inaccurate. My own copies will prove my complicity, but they will also prove the crime. You cannot have one without the other. He knew they'd come for the documents someday. He knew everything. He planned for everything. A pause. Caleb, this changes the hearing. This isn't just a legal argument anymore. It's Walter's own contemporaneous statement of intent recorded years before any litigation was contemplated. A judge will have a very hard time calling that stolen property. Will it be enough? I don't know, but it's the best card and we're playing it. The hearing was held on a Friday. The courtroom was fuller than it had ever been, not with lawyers this time, but with people. The people of Harlan Flats. Mrs. Tierney sat in the front row in a dark dress, her hands folded in her lap, her chin raised. Hardin the farmer sat behind her in his cleanest shirt, his weathered face set like carved wood. Jessie Crane was there with her son, asleep against her shoulder. There were others too, faces Caleb recognized from the meetings at the Quonset, people who had brought him their stories and their evidence, in their anger and their hope. They filled the small courtroom to capacity. Some stood along the back wall. The bailiff looked nervous. The judge, a gray-haired woman named Farnham, who had been on the bench for 20 years and had the tired, sharp eyes of someone who had seen every trick in the book, looked at the crowd over the rim of her glasses and said nothing. Garrett Stokes presented Vantage's argument with his usual polish. The documents were corporate property. They had been removed without authorization. The company had every right to reclaim them and review them for privileged material. His voice filled the room the way expensive cologne fills an elevator, pervasive, confident, slightly suffocating. Nora stood up. She was not polished. She did not fill the room. She stood at her table in a blazer that was slightly too large for her and spoke in a voice that was clear and even and carried no further than it needed to. She read Walter's journal entry aloud. She cited Section 14.3 of the State Engineering Board's Code of Conduct. She explained in plain language that the people in the gallery could follow that a licensed professional engineer has not only the right but the obligation to retain records of his own signed work, because that work carries his personal liability And because the integrity of the engineering profession depends on practitioners being able to document and, if necessary, account for their professional opinions. These are not stolen documents, Your Honor, Nora said. They are the professional records of a licensed engineer who spent 30 years trying to correct a catastrophic fraud that he was coerced into participating in. Walter Mercer didn't steal from Vantage Chemical. He kept receipts. And now his grandson is presenting those receipts to this court because the people sitting in this room, the people who have been drinking poisoned water and breathing contaminated air for decades, deserve to see them. The judge looked at Stokes. Stokes started to speak. Judge Farnham raised one hand. "I've heard enough on this motion," she said. Her voice was flat and dry and left no room for argument. "The motion to seize is denied. The documents will remain in the custody of the plaintiff." The courtroom exhaled. Not a cheer. These were not people who cheered in courtrooms, but a collective release of breath, a shifting of weight, a loosening of shoulders that had been braced for a blow. Mrs. Tierney closed her eyes. Hardin nodded once slowly, the way a man nods when something he suspected has been confirmed. Caleb sat very still. His hands were flat on the table in front of him. He could feel his heartbeat in his fingertips. They were still in the fight. "He's been sitting on this for 25 years, Caleb. A quarter of a century of silence. He said he couldn't sleep. He said he watched the segment 3 times, and the third time he picked up the phone because he couldn't stand it anymore." "What does he have?" "Everything. He has his own copies of the shipping manifest, the logistics records from the disposal subsidiary, dates, barrel counts, chemical codes, destination coordinates. He kept them in a storage unit in Dayton. He's had them since 1997 when he left the company." "Why didn't he come forward before?" "Same reason your grandfather couldn't get anyone to listen. Fear. Vantage made it very clear what happened to people who talked. Orwick had a wife, kids, a mortgage. He did what most people do. He chose his family over his conscience and tried to live with it. He said it ate at him every day. He said he dreamed about those barrels." She looked at Caleb steadily. "His records are independent of your grandfather's. Different source, different department, different chain of custody. They corroborate Walter's documents completely. If the surveys are the diagnosis, Orwick's manifest or the autopsy, together they make the case airtight. And Vantage can't claim these are stolen too. Orwick retained them as his personal operational records. Same principle as your grandfather, a professional documentation of his own work. But more importantly, his records blow up Vantage's entire defense strategy. They've been arguing that Walter was a lone, disgruntled employee fabricating evidence. Orwick proves he wasn't alone. He proves the evidence is real. 2 independent sources 25 years apart telling the exact same story. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the tea under the Quonset wall and stirred the dust on the floor. "He wants to testify," Nora said. "He wants to go on the record. He said, and these are his words, he said he's 71 years old and he's tired of being afraid." Caleb thought of his grandfather, a man who had also been tired of being afraid, but who had run out of time before the world was ready to listen. "Tell him thank you," Caleb said. "Tell him we'll be ready." The Federal Environmental Protection Agency opened its investigation 4 days after Dale Orwick's sworn affidavit was filed with the court. It was not a voluntary decision. The EPA had known about Harlan Flats, or should have known for years. Walter Mercer had contacted them directly in the early days of his crusade, before the lawyers and the litigation had ground him down. His letters were in the agency's files unanswered, ignored, buried in the bureaucratic sediment of a system that was too slow, too cautious, too easily influenced by the corporate lobbyists who walked its hallways with the comfortable familiarity of old friends. But now there were 2 independent sets of evidence, a lawsuit that was gaining national attention, a story that was being read by millions of people, a 71-year-old man willing to testify under oath, and a courtroom in a small county in the American interior filled with citizens who had been poisoned and who were no longer willing to be quiet about it. The EPA sent a team, 3 geologists, 2 hydrologists, a toxicologist, and a project manager in a government sedan. They arrived in Harlan Flats on a Tuesday morning and set up a mobile testing station in the field behind the Quonset hut. They drilled core samples. They tested groundwater. They took soil readings at 30 different points across the area, working their way outward from the coordinates listed in Walter Mercer's original surveys. Caleb watched them work. He stood at the edge of his property in the early morning, cold, his hands in the pockets of the coat misses. Dunham had given him the coat he still wore every day, the only gift anyone had given him in years. And he watched the drill bits go into the ground and the sample tubes come back up, and he thought about his grandfather doing the same thing decades ago, standing in the same dirt, looking at the same sky, knowing what was down there, and being powerless to make anyone care. The results came back in 11 days. Trichloroethylene levels in the groundwater 14 times the federal safety limit, benzene 9 times, vinyl chloride 22 times. The soil was saturated with industrial solvents to a depth of 30 feet across an area of approximately 4 square miles. The contamination plume had migrated into the aquifer that supplied drinking water to every well in Harlan Flats and 3 neighboring communities, 22 times the safety limit, for decades, in the water that families drank and cooked with and bathed their children in. Divided among 37 families, it wasn't a fortune for any single household, but for people who had been struggling with medical bills and failing wells in a dying local economy, it was real. It was tangible. It was money in hand now, instead of more years of litigation with an uncertain outcome. There's a condition, Nora continued. Her voice was steady. A permanent non-disclosure agreement. Every plaintiff signs. No one speaks publicly about the contamination, the evidence, or the terms of the settlement. Ever. The case is sealed. The documents are sealed. The EPA investigation continues on its own track, but our role in it ends. We walk away with the money and the silence. The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight that presses down on the people sitting in it and makes them aware of the thinness of the air. Mrs. Tierney spoke first. How much would Frank's death be worth under their formula? Nora looked at her. Approximately $420,000 based on the criteria they have outlined. $420,000, Mrs. Tierney repeated. She said it the way you say the may of a place you've never been. For a man's life, for 43 years of marriage and 3 children and a house he built with his own hands. It's their number, Ruth, not mine. I know whose number it is. A farmer named Hardin leaned forward in his chair. His forearms rested on his knees, his big hands clasped together. What happens if we don't take it? The lawsuit continues, discovery continues, the EPA investigation continues. Vantage will fight us at every step, but the evidence is strong, stronger now with Arwick's testimony and the EPA findings. A trial could be 2 years away, maybe 3, and there's no guarantee of the outcome. A jury might award more than $15 million, or less, or nothing. But the truth stays public, Hardin said. Yes, if we go to trial, everything is on the record, permanently. The room murmured. People leaned toward each other and whispered. Caleb could feel the fracture forming, not a clean break, but a slow splitting like wood under pressure. On one side, the people who were tired, who had been fighting for months and were sick and broke and scared and wanted it to be over, who looked at the money and saw an end to the pain. On the other side, the people who looked at the money and saw a price tag on their silence, who understood in a way that went deeper than logic that some things cannot be bought back once they are sold. Jessie Crane stood up. Her son was not with her tonight. Her voice was thin and shaking. My boy is 5. He has a kidney condition that 3 doctors have told me they can't explain. I don't have insurance. I'm 2 months behind on rent. If I take my share of this money, I can pay his medical bills and move us somewhere safe. She paused. Her jaw worked. But if I sign that paper, I'm telling him when he's old enough to ask that I took money to stay quiet about the thing that made him sick. I don't know if I can live with that. She sat down. No one spoke. Caleb had been standing at the back of the room, leaning against the metal wall, listening. He had not planned to speak. This was their decision, the community's decision, not his. He was a newcomer here, an outsider, a kid who had been in Harlan Flats for less than a year. He had no right to tell these people what to do with their pain, but they were looking at him, all of them. One by one, the faces turned toward the back of the room, toward the bum who had started all of this by refusing to sell a piece of dirt for $250,000. He pushed himself off the wall and walked to the front. He stood next to Nora and looked out at the room at the tired faces and the folded hands and the eyes that held equal measures of hope and exhaustion. "I'm not going to tell you what to do," he said. His voice was quiet. "I don't have the right. You've lived here your whole lives. You've buried people you love. You've watched your kids get sick. I've been here less than a year, and I came with nothing, so it's easy for me to talk about principles. I know that." He paused. The room was absolutely still. "But I want to tell you something my grandfather wrote. He spent 30 years trying to undo a mistake he made when he was young. He stayed quiet when he should have spoken up, and it cost him everything: his wife, his son, his reputation, his peace of mind. He wrote in his journal that the silence was worse than anything they could have done to him. The silence was the thing that ate him alive." He looked at Mrs. Tierney. He looked at Jesse Crane. He looked at Hardin. $15 million is a lot of money, and it will run out. The day you cash that check, the clock starts, and one day the money will be gone. But the chemicals in the ground won't be gone. The water won't be clean. Your grandchildren will drink from the same wells and play in the same dirt, and nobody will know why they're sick because we all signed a piece of paper that said we'd never tell. He stopped. He felt the weight of what he was asking, not asking exactly, but implying, suggesting, laying before them like a stone on a scale. "My grandfather chose silence once, and it destroyed him. He left me everything he had so I could choose differently. That's what I'm doing. But this isn't my choice to make for anyone else. Whatever you decide, I'll stand by it." He stepped back. The vote was not unanimous. It was never going to be. 3 families voted to accept the settlement. They had their reasons, and they were good reasons, and Caleb did not judge them. They had earned the right to choose their own peace. The rest 34 families voted to continue. The settlement was rejected. The months that followed were the hardest and the most important of Caleb's life. The case moved forward. Discovery produced a flood of internal Vantage documents that confirmed and expanded everything Walter and Orwick had provided. Emails from executives discussing the cost savings of improper disposal, meeting minutes where environmental concerns raised by junior staff were dismissed as alarmist. A memo from the company's general counsel advising that the risk of detection was minimal because, and the language was precise, and damning, the affected communities lacked the resources and sophistication to mount a credible legal challenge. That memo was read aloud in open court. Caleb watched the faces of the people in the gallery as the words landed. Mrs. Tierney's expression did not change. She had known. They had all known in the wordless way that people know when they have been dismissed by those who hold power over them. Vantage's board of directors fired the CEO in an attempt to contain the damage. Their stock price, which had been declining steadily since the EPA report, dropped 18% in a single day after the internal memos were made public. Crestline Properties quietly withdrew from all pending land acquisitions in the Harlan Flats area. The shell company that was supposed to bury the evidence had itself been buried. The EPA committed to a 10-year remediation plan for Harlan Flats and the 3 affected neighboring communities. Federal funds were allocated. A water treatment facility would be built. The contaminated soil would be excavated and removed. It was not a perfect solution. The damage done to the aquifer would take generations to fully reverse. But it was a beginning. It was an acknowledgement in concrete and steel and federal dollars that the people of Harlan Flats had been wronged and that someone was finally going to do something about it. The trial itself was still months away. The legal machinery ground on slow and relentless, and Nora warned Caleb that it might be another year or 2 before a jury heard the case. But the landscape had shifted. Vantage was no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to limit the damage. They were in retreat, and everyone, the judge, the media, the public, could see it. On a cold evening in late November, almost a year to the day since he had first stepped off the bus at the crossroads, Caleb Mercer sat at his grandfather's desk in the Ark. The bunker had changed. Not physically. The concrete walls were the same. The shelves were the same. The single bulb still hummed its low, constant note. But the feeling of the place had shifted. It was no longer a tomb. It was no longer a war room. It was a foundation. The thing on which everything above it had been built. The Quonset had changed too. Above his head on the surface, the old tin shed had become something that almost resembled a home. He had built a proper wood stove from the oil drum and salvaged pipe, And on cold nights, the orange glow of the fire threw warm, shifting shadows on the curved metal walls. He had a garden, small, careful, planted in soil he had tested and retested with kits Nora had brought him that produced tomatoes and beans and greens through the summer and fall. He had a generator bought with some of Walter's fight money that gave him electricity for a few hours each evening. A satellite dish on the roof connected him to the internet and to the wider world that had slowly become aware that Harlan Flats existed. The barbed wire fence had been repaired. The weeds had been cleared. A path of flat stones led from the road to the front door. A real door. Now not just a sliding panel of rusted metal, but a solid wooden door that Caleb had built himself from lumber he'd bought in the nearest real town. He was putting down roots. The phrase had once been a metaphor. Now it was literal. His hands were calloused and scarred and permanently stained with wheat, and when he looked at them in the light of the desk lamp, he saw his grandfather's hands. The same scars, the same stains, the same quiet capability. On the desk in front of him, next to the ham radio and the stacked notebooks, sat a new leather-bound journal. He had bought it months ago but had not yet written in it. It had felt presumptuous somehow to place his own words alongside Walter's, to continue a record that had been kept by a man who had lived and suffered and built things that Caleb was only beginning to understand. But tonight he opened it. He uncapped a pen, not a pencil like Walter used, but a pen because the things he was about to write were not drafts, and he sat for a long time looking at the blank first page. He thought about the clock on the wall of the administrative office, the dry bone snap of each second counting down to an eviction he had believed was an ending. He thought about the manila envelope, the $6, the satellite image of a silver-gray shape on a flat brown square of nothing. He thought about the bus ride, 18 hours of rattling glass and shrinking cities, and a landscape opening up like a held breath being released. The crossroads, the flickering neon, the 5-mile walk in the dark under a sky so full of stars it looked like the ceiling of the world had been torn away. He thought about the first night in the hut, the cold, the dark, the smell of rust and rot and mouse. The tears he had shed not for himself but for a man he barely remembered, a man who turned out to have been so much more than the quiet, sad grandfather who smelled of pipe smoke and motor oil. He thought about the lock, 172, the click of the combination, the heavy lid rising, the letter. His name in Walter's handwriting, the moment the world split open and showed him what was underneath. He thought about Holloway's smile, Stokes's voice, the courtroom, the faces in the gallery. Mrs. Tierney's hands steady in her lap. Jesse Crane's thin voice shaking but unbroken. Hardin's slow nod. He thought about Dale Orwick, a 71-year-old man in Dayton, Ohio, who had watched the news one night and decided he was done being afraid. He thought about Miss Dunham standing at the door of the group home on a Friday morning with a coat and a sandwich, doing something that was not her job because she understood the difference between a job and a purpose. He thought about Nora Belwick driving her beat-up truck down a gravel road to meet a teenager in a tin shed and seeing not a hopeless case but a fight worth taking. And he thought about Walter, the man who had built this room with his own hands, who had poured the concrete and hung the shelves and wired the light and carried the evidence down the stairs piece by piece, year by year alone, who had written his confession in leather-bound notebooks and sealed it in a steel box and buried it under a Quonset hut in the middle of nowhere, trusting that one day somehow the right person would find it. The right person. His grandson, a boy the system had tried to erase. Caleb put the pen to the page. My name is Caleb Mercer. I am 18 years old. I am the grandson of Walter Mercer, who was a geological engineer and a flawed man and the bravest person I have ever known. This is the second volume of a record that my grandfather began decades ago. He wrote the first volume alone in this room in the dark, carrying a weight that no one should have to carry by themselves. He did it anyway. He did it because he believed that the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, will always find its way back to the surface. Not on its own, it needs someone to dig. He couldn't finish the work. He ran out of time. So he left it for me, not as a burden, but as a trust. The way a father leaves a house to his son. Not because the house is perfect, but because it's built on solid ground and it's worth the keeping. I don't know how this story ends. The case is still open. The fight is still going. There are days when I am afraid, and nights when the silence in this room feels less like peace and more like the held breath before a storm. But I am here, I am not leaving, and I am not quiet. He paused. He looked at the pen in his hand. He looked at the concrete walls, solid and close and unchanging. He listened to the hum of the light bulb, that low, constant, faithful sound that had kept his grandfather company through all those years of solitary work. Then he wrote one more line. He gave me a direction. I will not stop. He closed the journal. He placed it on the desk beside Walter's notebooks, the old beside the new, the finished beside the just begun. He sat there for a moment in the stillness, in the yellow light, in the underground room that had been a tomb and a vault and a war room and was now, at last, simply a home. Then Caleb Mercer stood up, climbed the steel stairs, and pushed open the hatch into the Quonset above. The night air hit his face cold and clean, and carrying the scent of turned earth from his garden and wood smoke from the stove, and beneath it all the faintest trace of that chemical bitterness that might take a generation to fully fade. He stood there in the doorway of the old tin shed, the metal walls curving above him like the ribs of some great patient animal, and he looked out at the land. His land, 1.2 acres of scarred earth under a sky so wide and dark and full of stars that it made him feel as it had on the very first night, both terribly small and strangely, impossibly exactly where he was supposed to be. The wind moved across the flat ground and pressed against the Quonset and made the metals sing a low, resonant hum, almost like a voice. He listened to it for a long time. Then he went back inside, closed the door, and fed the fire. This whole journey started because I was given something that looked worthless on the surface, a rusty shed on a patch of dirt. But underneath it was the most valuable thing in the world, a chance to make a difference. It was a legacy. And I think a lot of us carry those inheritances. Maybe it's not a bunker full of evidence. Maybe it's a story your grandmother told you, a principle your father lived by, a promise you made to someone you lost. It's the thing that calls to you, that asks you to be better, to be braver. It's the harder right. What's the most important thing you've ever inherited that had nothing to do with money,